I like this one. You guys ever heard that term, ride for the brand? I grew up with it. Again, Westerns, John Wayne movies. I read Louis L'Amour's Zane Grey. That was a term that was given. When you take a job, you ride for the brand. That brand was the symbol of the owner, the rancher who owned the cattle. That brand was placed upon every cow, every steer in the herd. And the cowboys were known by that brand. In Texas, there were the XT, exit cowboys. And that's what they called them, the exits. In the Old West, when a cowboy rode for the brand, it meant he had signed on to the mission, goals and aims of the ranch owner. It meant that he was committed and that he was a dedicated team player. It meant he gave his promise to protect the brand as though it were his own. How many of us take that type of extreme ownership in our lives? You know, it's really easy to blame somebody else, not take the responsibility. You know, if we look at it and, well, I'm working on this job for someone, but it's not my job, it's my boss's job. But if we treated it as it was our own, that we were putting our name on it, how different would we be? Again, you ride for that brand. You sign on to do the job, you see it through to the end. I know being a kid at times, that was one of the biggest lessons that I learned in going to work for someone. And I had an older brother, thankfully, who had also watched the same movies. And he would look at me, and it's like, it doesn't matter how tired you are. You signed on for this 8, 10, 12-hour day. Don't quit. And as a kid, my muscles were killing me, blisters, everything, exhausted. I really wanted to go have a snack and watch cartoons. But when I made it to the end of the day, and maybe it was just surviving to the end of the day, I stood there with all the men, and I felt like one of them. It's learning commitment. You know, the job's not over till we get to the end of the trail. All the way to the end. Our marriages, our covenant with God, it's all the way to the end. When we make that commitment, when we're baptized, do we know what's going to happen? Do we know how hard it's going to be to live with that commitment? No. But when we give it, we have to say, no matter what, I will not quit. If we knew how hard it was going to be married, but it doesn't matter. When I say I do, I'm committed to the end, till death do us part. For me, that's one of the biggest things, that just saying it makes you feel like more of a man. I'm going to not worry about what's left here. Gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and take a break. We've got some food. Break time. See? There we go. We'll take 10, run to the restrooms, grab some food here. Mr. Rohde was unable to be with us today. He's snowed in, so we will have 2 speakers, but we'll go ahead and break for some snacks.
I told my wife, they might as well just cut it off and give me cost better. Tired of dealing with it.
I didn't use this job
Bad anyway.
night's rest, it'll be good. Well, gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started with the second portion of our club, the speaking aspect of it. Again, with Mr. Rohde being snowed in, they got drifted in pretty good. He is unable to be here, and so we are going to have two speakers. One will be Mr. Lawrence Uhlich, and the other will be Mr. Shawn Richardson. So we will go ahead and get started and introduce Mr. Lawrence Uhlich.
This is what I'm calling the title, the parallel of the Bibles of the things I wonder about. The first parallel is in Exodus 14, verse 16. It tells about God leading the Israelites out of Egypt through the Red Sea. He parted the Red Sea that they could walk on dry land. And then the other, what I call parallel, is in when God parted the Jordan River, that the Israelites could cross over to the land of Canaan. I call that a parallel. Today they about the same. And then the second one is in the wilderness. In Exodus 13, verse 18, it tells about God taking the Israelites out of Egypt into the wilderness. And I'm wondering if this would be a parallel. In Revelation 12:14, it talks about the woman on given two wings that she could, two wings on like on an eagle, she could fly to a place of safety away from the serpent. So I'm thinking that's a parallel too. Them two together. And then and about the murmuring that they did when they was murmuring and complaining about Moses and Aaron in Exodus 16, verse 2. The whole community of Israelites complained about Moses and about Aaron. And my wondering is, will we complain about our leader when we go to the place of safety, or will we just obey him and not complain? And then, and what will we be doing in a place of safety? It looked like in Exodus 16:23, God had to show the Israelites the Sabbath day, because it reads, Moses said to them, this is what the Lord said today. Today is Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake today and boil what you want to boil today, because and to save what's left over for tomorrow for you to in the morning for you to eat. And the other, this is about us in a place of safety. Will Christ or some of the angels be there to teach us what we're going to be doing in our job in the kingdom? And then, should we start carrying around this wilderness survival kit, like with a Bible in it, a notebook, and a paper pencil? Because we don't really know what we're going to have in a place of safety. So should we start carrying that around? And then the other thing is about the two witnesses. Will some of the people in the Church of God not really believe the two witnesses because they didn't come from their group? So they can't be the two witnesses. I wonder about that. And then I always thought that the two witnesses, for some reason, was going to be Americans, and I could understand Americans. And then lately I've started to thinking, what does the German or the French people think? Do they think they're going to speak German or French? So will there be sort of like will the two witnesses be sort of like on the day of Pentecost, when everybody heard in their own language? Like Acts 2:18, it reads, And how is this that we hear them in our own language, the language we was born in? Now, so I wonder if that's going to be a parallel somehow or another. And, oh yeah, will they need a translator, or will they have a translator? And then if they have a translator, could you really believe what the translator was saying? Because you don't know how they're going to twist it around to say what they want to say. Now, these are the things that I'm thinking about. The Bible is a parallel, and most of the things I wonder about, I think only God really knows the answer to them.
Well, thank you, Mr. Uhlich. I think those are some great Bible study questions and things that we can definitely ponder on. Anyone have any words of encouragement, instruction for Mr. Uhlich? Mr. Cook?
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Lawrence, I like your topic and the different points on the parallels and how you brought out the fact that God is the one who's going to be sure that we know what is going on in all those things, and truthfully, I think it looks like He'll be preparing us for it, and we will have some knowledge of that. But to get up there and speak in front of a bunch of men and stuff, I personally know how tough that can be myself. But to encourage you maybe a little bit, maybe you could have took one or two of those parallels and gave a little more information on them. Like when Israel came out of Egypt, maybe the difficulties and the hard times that they had, living in the wilderness, or the manna. Why did God have them just get the manna and it stunk on the seventh day? Maybe just gave a little more expounding on those type of things, and you could maybe use a little more time that way. But I thought you did a good job, and you brought out some good things to think about.
Very good, thank you. Anyone else have a word of encouragement or instruction? We'll hand the mic, or Mr. Zemlicka.
Well, congratulations on getting up there and speaking, and I know it's quite a task when you're not used to doing it. And I think, like Dave was saying, you can narrow a subject down, something where you can kind of expound on it and not include your notes quite so much. You had so much material, but if you had something you knew and you could talk about, you get a better. I don't think you ever looked this direction at all. You don't know that when you're doing that, but so you're so tied to your notes. And I think that would help to know your subject, and then to be able to talk about it without your notes. But a good job, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zemlicka. I think Mr. Dave Helseth, did you have your...
Lawrence, those are thought-provoking questions, and I wrote a couple down. I'm going to look at myself a little bit more deeply. With a speech, we were instructed, or there's 4 elements of a speech, basically. And if you wrote this down, even write them down now: introduction, SPS with specific purpose statement, body, and conclusion. That allows a person to formulate their basic structure of the speech, where you have a beginning, a purpose, a body, which describes what you're trying to do, and your conclusion, which summarizes the whole speech. So just remember SPS, body, introduction, SPS, body, conclusion. That helps a person formulate their speech, and when they write those down on a piece of paper and then fill everything in under that makes a more fluid structure to a speech. But good job, G, for even getting up there.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. I think that's one of the greatest, it's recognized that one of the greatest fears is public speaking. Actually having to get up and speak in front of people. And it's funny because I do it now as part of my calling in life, but I remember the first time I had to give a speech in a class, being terrified. And And so again, thank you for volunteering. He volunteered. We didn't twist his arm to do something. And again, all good advice and encouraging. And I think if you wanted to take something like one of those questions, or like, I really like the complaining one, because I think we have the example of that in the Bible. It's human nature, and when I get tired of complaining, I think, well, but how much do I complain? Well, a lot. So you can pick a topic like that, and then apply the rules as Mr. Helseth said. This is your topic, this is your introduction, this is the purpose of why you want to talk about that, and then flesh that out for yourself. And that would make a really good message. So thank you very much. So now we will move on to our second speaker. We're going to be hearing again this morning, or I guess we're afternoon now, from Mr. Shawn Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Good afternoon. Well, excuse me, good start. Should have done that before I came up. Good afternoon. Okay, well, I decided to write my speech today on commitment because I'm committed to make sure you are committed. So, actually, I didn't want to say too much earlier because then I'd give all away my whole speech. So, but today I did want to share with you some of the things that I have learned about what commitment is, and what I have learned, why I have learned to embrace it. And you probably have heard the same, maybe Mr. Johnson has heard this saying, commitment can be illustrated by a breakfast of bacon and eggs, because the chicken was involved, but it was actually the pig that was committed. So, but in our case, perhaps it's the turkey that filled in for the pig. So, commitment, though, can be a very heavy topic to many, and in fact, some will go out of their way to avoid it altogether. And there's a stigma attached to commitment. In fact, fear of commitment is a very popular phrase that's used today, mostly referring to those trying to avoid long-term partnerships in marriage. There's the joke that says that the guy talks about that his girlfriend says that he has commitment issues. Well, technically, she's my wife, but too many do consider marriage and many commitments to be restrictive and confining, and they require a great deal of sacrifice, like the turkey or the pig for that breakfast. Marriage is pushed in Hollywood and in society as being a trap, a ball and chain. It's treated as daunting, tiresome, taking on a heavy responsibility for another person, and putting a large amount of trust into another person. In fact, there's even a clinical term called gamophobia, which is the fear of marriage, or the psychological fear of attachment to another person. Even more, though, is the word misogamy, which means the hatred of marriage. Although this was first coined back in 1656, so just my last few hundred years. Interesting, though, commitment is at the foundation of Christianity and the biblical principles, and marriage is just one of those prominent roles that it gives. Marriage, as the Bible characterizes it, helps us to define what our role is and help us better understand what it means to be committed. For one, it's long-term. It's never fickle. It teaches us that as long as it's good, we can make the most of it by not giving up until death do us part. Galatians 6:9 says, "Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not grow weary or if we don't give up." In modern times, the sanctity of marriage has all been eliminated. Even if one is brave enough to enter into a marriage, it's really viewed as nothing more than signing a legal document that can just be tossed away without a second thought. Aside perhaps maybe paying alimony, but we have prenups for that. So today, the world just simply eliminates the morality that's behind it. History teaches us that moral commitments are much stronger than just legal ones, or I should say that moral commitments are stronger than legal commitments. Breaking a legal commitment really can get you thrown in jail or maybe pay a fine, but breaking moral commitments has led to wars being waged. We can take this a step further by understanding biblically by looking at baptism, another one we have discussed earlier. Luke 9:62 says, And Yeshua said to him, "No one having put his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the reign of God." Commitment is much more than just saying that you will do something. It's putting your full self and trust in charge of your actions and then never looking back. Deuteronomy 6:5 does say that we shall love Jehovah, our Elohim, with all our heart, with all our being, and with all our might. So whether right or wrong, a commitment is a personal choice to fully dedicate ourselves to a cause, heart, mind, and soul. It's interesting because this week was the 18th anniversary of my own baptism. And it reminded me of one of the biggest lessons I've learned regarding commitment. And not just because of the baptism itself, but rather the path it took for me to get to that point. You see, it was actually about 34 years ago when I initially wanted to be baptized. My parents and I were very close. I was the only child. And our path of discovering the truth and living that truth, we did together as a very close-knit family. And I was about 12 when we came into Worldwide. And it was also about that age that I was becoming very deeply engaged in my own religious path. And I knew I wanted to make it a priority in my life. And within a year of coming in, my parents began counseling for baptism. And most of those sessions, the minister came out to our home. So I was actually there and was very attentive to the discussions that were being made. And I made it known that I also wanted to be baptized. But of course, I wasn't allowed to because I was too young. I really simply couldn't understand this at the time. And don't get me wrong, I was grasping the concepts. I knew what the concept was to count the cost. And I knew it was a lifetime dedication. But I was still too young to really understand what that lifetime was and what that cost really was. But even though the church wouldn't let me be baptized, I did still make a promise to God to live my life according to His truth. However, I was constantly reminded of that restraint, the restriction that was put upon me, especially with every Passover that came by. And I wasn't allowed to even attend the Passover, much less take part in the ceremony. And I hate to say it, but I really became indignant to that. And it really proved to myself later just why I wasn't yet ready. Because instead of committing myself to taking the time to better prepare myself to be baptized when I was old enough, I instead convinced myself that I had already made that promise to God. I was already living my life by keeping His ways, but deep down I was still holding on to that bitterness. And sure enough, when the time did come that I could have been allowed to counsel for baptism, I ignored it. Although I thought it was nothing more than just a public display of going through the motions of being dunked in water. And not too long after that, actually I would consider myself spiritually baptized. So, and not too long after that, of course, Worldwide began to fall apart. And that bitterness inside me grew even more because I began to distrust the ministry, especially after they started accepting Sunday as an acceptable Sabbath. We got surveys at feast saying, would you like to have feast next year on an extended weekend or maybe during the summer when school is out? So I just, that really increased that bitterness. And then I stopped attending services regularly. Of course, there was not much place to go, but I really didn't seek out a new place to go either. And looking back at that time, it could have been a really serious diversion to my walk with God. But He did continue to work with me, and I did eventually return to church. But it wasn't until I turned 28 years old, right around the time, actually not too long after 9/11, and we had an amazing feast in Ireland that year, and I came to the realization of what I had really done. Yes, I was keeping the Sabbath, I was keeping the holy days, I was reading the Bible and praying every day, and I was allowing that turkey to make that sacrifice for my breakfast. But all that never stopped. But I had not followed through on my promise because I had not yet obligated myself to be baptized, regardless of the restrictions that were put on me as a child. But I was the one standing in the way of fulfilling that promise. And that's the lesson really I learned, that a promise, even a conviction, while it is very important, is merely an outward agreement or an oath that we make with others. Whereas a commitment is an agreement or an oath that we make within ourselves, internally in our hearts. Our promises with others are only as good as the commitment that we put into keeping them and truly devoting ourselves to them. So we can always promise to be there for our wives. We can promise God to always follow Him. But if we're not committed within ourselves and have that internalized agreement, then we are not truly committed to our promises. And that's a good thing, because God considers our hearts, not just our actions, because outwardly we will mess up from time to time. But if we lose our commitment, or if we've never made that commitment to begin with, then that's when we can truly fail, and we only have ourselves to blame. I was committed at a young age, and God would have known that when he was looking at my heart if I had really committed myself, but I also would have followed through. I wasn't mature enough to know and appreciate the promise that I was making in my heart. Eventually I did get baptized, but only after grasping this realization of what I had done. But it did make my baptism that much more meaningful. Psalm 37, verse 3 says, "Trust in Jehovah and do good. Delight in yourself in Jehovah, and let him give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to Jehovah and trust in him, and he does it. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light and your right ruling as midday." With the power of God on our side, true commitment means giving your full trust, never looking back. And if we sow what is good, we will reap great blessings. It's never restrictive, never confining, but rather it gives us the ultimate freedom. And after being baptized just one short month later, I met Reagan, where I had another great commitment that I can make in a marriage.
Well, thank you, Mr. Richardson. Would anyone like to make a comment, give a word of encouragement, instruction? Yeah, Greg, and then we'll go to Gabe. Let me hand the microphone.
I think that he doesn't need much room for improvement. I think he presented his speech in a positive, uplifting manner, and that's about all I have to say, I guess.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. We'll have Gabe Holsworth.
I thought that it was very well done. I don't know, you hit the time right on. I don't know much about timing, I guess. But even just the way that you spoke was helpful to me, even now, even though it's just a men's club speech. And I wasn't taking it down, but I'm pretty sure you also nailed the structure. You had a great introduction, and I wasn't taking notes, so I don't know exactly what your specific purpose statement was, but I'm pretty sure that it was there in your body and your conclusion. I guess I would say that it was awesome.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Shawn, I thought it was very good. You can see your emotion, your conviction and commitment, the way you presented it. But what I thought was really good that you introduced in your speaking was you got some humor, and humor is really pretty important, I think, to not overly humor, but it brings a person's attention to to what you're saying. And you did good time, as I did ask Mr. Cunningham. You were within 2 seconds, so you did really good on your timing. But you had a lot to give, and it was well worthwhile listening. I appreciate everything you said. But maybe if it could have just, maybe if there's any kind of a thing I could say is maybe slow down just a little bit, even though you used up your time, but you were talking quite fast. You had quite a bit going on there, which was good material. There's nothing wrong with that. Just that maybe it's a little more easier hearing if, of course, maybe my ears are going bad, or I don't know, but it was maybe you slow down a little more in your speaking. But everything you had was fabulous, and it was well worthwhile, and we all can learn from it. And also, we got to know quite a bit more about yourself.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to make a comment? I would just say that, again, I loved how you illustrated the example of, being involved or being convicted and being committed with the bacon and eggs. the chicken gave a couple eggs, and like I said, in our case, turkey or beef, something like that, it's life. It's in it, and that's a wonderful example. And the humor got everybody involved, grabbed everyone, but also your honesty and sincerity in sharing what is a very intimate part of our lives. The commitment that we make in our baptism for life. Everyone comes to that place at a different time, a different place in our lives with our own struggles, the things that we struggle with in making that commitment. And the honesty with which you shared yours, I think that was very powerful. And so I just want to say thank you for that. And that's a lesson for all of us. In learning how to speak, we give, they're told, well, give a story, give an example, give an illustration. And they're very powerful. They're very effective. They have to be done correctly, though, or we're just telling stories. But when you relate something along these lines in a very honest, very sincere, and forthright manner, we can be convinced in our mind, but what truly makes us committed is our heart. Having those two, that's what really goes hand in hand. I think as Shawn mentioned in his life growing up, there was a time in the history of our church where it was decided that, oh, you don't need to keep the Sabbath anymore. We're going to change all these things, and we're just kind of doing away with that. And there were many people who had the truth and the knowledge for decades. And they were convinced that it was true. But when they were told that they didn't have to do it anymore, or it was made difficult for them to keep that, without the commitment and the heart, then the conviction went away. And we have that in our own personal lives, and it needs to be a part of our speaking. Whether it's doing something here to the men's club, whether it's speaking brother to brother, or potentially giving a message in front of all the brethren, that we have that same commitment to speak the truth and to let God work through us. I think for everyone who speaks, who's spoken in the past to the brethren, who's doing on a regular basis, that struggle that you go through in preparing the message and what it is that you're going to share and how you're asking God to bless it. And truly, when we're committed, He does bless it. Sometimes you might feel like you're like Peter getting out of the boat. And as long as he was committed and kept his eyes right, it went pretty well. God was blessing it. It was when he stopped and started second guessing, and like the plowman, he started to look back. The boat was getting further away. That's when he started to sink. I would say, just to kind of wrap up on this men's club and looking at commitment, it is such a vital aspect of our being, as our integrity as men, not only for ourselves and our look, at within, but for everyone else, especially our families, our wives, our children, our relationships, that they know that you are a man of commitment. A man who is convicted, convinced, but also committed. Because when you are, they relax. They know they can trust you. Whether it's your employer, I don't have to worry about Lawrence because I know he'll do the job because he said he would. Our spouse, You're out, you're working, you're doing things. I know that he's working. I know he's faithful because I trust him. He's proven it over and over again. And these are the things that actually help us as well. Next month, we will have another men's club. I'll ask for at least 2 more speakers. We might go ahead and do 3. But next month, we will have the third and final portion of this series, which is courage. We've had conviction, commitment, and courage. So these are the things to think about, things that we'll be discussing in the first portion of the men's club. And then what I'd like you to be thinking about if you're going to speak on it is the courage that it takes to fulfill the convictions, to fulfill the commitments. So with that, we'll go ahead and be done. And I want to say thank you again for all of you being here and your participation. So let's go ahead and break. We'll clean up and get ready for services.